All right, welcome. Today we are going to read about the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act, unlike the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act is a direct tax. They're not messing around anymore. We're specifically taxing the 13 colonies. No bones about it. You're going to pay up. And this was issued by Parliament in 1765. Now, before we actually get into reading this, I have something for you. And I hope this will help you out. See, before the Stamp Act, there's the Sugar Act and a few other things. And I think that it might be better if somebody a lot more qualified than me explains this. Now, the video you're about to see is of a professor from Yale, one of the best colleges in the United States. So I hope you enjoy this. Let's see, we just do a little bit of popping that up, and then we make Mr. Taylor go away by clicking on this, and here we go.
In 1764, Grenville also decided he's going to clamp down on colonial currency, because during the war, several colonies, and especially Virginia, had issued vast amounts of paper money. And Grenville, basically, he's trying to assert control over the monetary system too. So in 1764, he passes the Currency Act. And the Currency Act says the colonies can't issue money, that any act passed by a colonial legislature that violates this act is null and void, and that any colonial governor who consented to such an act on the part of the colonies, any colonial governor that allows his colony to produce currency would be fined £1,000, which is a huge amount of money at that point, would be dismissed from office, and would be ineligible from any public office in future. Okay, that's obviously a serious, we really, really, really mean this about the whole currency issue. We're putting some serious punishments on the line here. So, taken all together, Americans, colonists, drew several not-so-happy conclusions from all of these actions. So first, obviously, they're alarmed at the sudden clamping down on what, in their eyes at least, had been a working system, right? Everything had been okay, the system's working, we're profiting from what we're doing, the crown, the empire is profiting too, it's working perfectly well. Now all of a sudden, things are being changed and teeth are being put in where there weren't teeth before. Second, informed that they had to go to Nova Scotia if they smuggled and that there'd be no jury during their trial, they began to feel like second-class citizens being denied a basic fundamental British right of a trial by jury. Third, they were alarmed at the implications of the Currency Act. Because the implications are, if you think about it, Grenville basically saying he can nullify an act passed by a colonial assembly. That's, in the minds of the colonists, a pretty alarming precedent. And then finally, fourth, colonists were also alarmed that these new duties and these new acts that are being enforced were largely intended to fund a standing army in the colonies. A standing army that Parliament saw as being protective, but you can also see how the colonists might have seen this as a threat, right? Well, if we don't listen to all of this stuff, there's a standing army here that we're actually funding. So the colonists could have seen that armed force as a sign of tyranny, as a threat to enforce colonial cooperation. So for all of these reasons, these acts are problematic, threatening, frightening, and get people thinking.
So what we're seeing here is a series of facts. We've got the Sugar Act, which has laid the groundwork on if you violate any of these anti-smuggling laws, and if you don't pay the taxes on sugar, that you've got to go up to modern-day Canada, pay for the trip yourself, and get a trial without a jury. There's the Currency Act saying that if you try to create a law in the assemblies in the colony where you actually get to vote to make money, then that law goes away. And if they can do it to those, they can do it to anything. People are very angry. And while the Stamp Act was bad, and while the Stamp Act made people very angry, it wasn't just the Stamp Act that caused the really big violence that we see happen immediately after the Stamp Act. It's a combination of the Sugar Act, the Currency Act, and then you get the Stamp Act, where it's just like, it's kind of like the punching bag where it gets all of it. So the Stamp Act required that many printed materials in the colonies be produced on stamped paper produced in London, carrying an embossed revenue stamp. Printed materials included legal documents, magazines, playing cards, newspapers, and many other types of paper used throughout the colonies, and it had to be paid in British currency, not in colonial paper money. You must use paper made in England. You must pay for it using British pounds and sterling and the money actually made in Britain. You can't use any of the money that you used to make in the colonies. That stuff's not good anymore. You must pay for it using British money. And the stuff we're going to force you to basically buy is, well, stuff you have to have. See, the Sugar Act taxed a bunch of stuff that were luxury items, and people just said, well, I don't like it, I won't buy it. Well, with the Stamp Act, they're taxing things that you have to have. You want to get married? You have to have a marriage license. It's printed on paper. Tax. You want to buy a house? You need a deed saying you own it. It's printed on paper. You have to pay a tax. Yeah. The purpose of the tax was, once again, to pay for British military troops stationed in the colonies after the French and Indian War, but the colonists during the French and Indian War had never really feared a French invasion to begin with, and they contended that they had already paid their fair share of the war expenses with, the Sugar Act. They feel like we didn't like it, but we paid it. And now you're doing it again. They suggested that it was actually a matter of British patronage to surplus British officers and career soldiers who should be paid by London. What they're saying is, look, there's not any real threat out here in the colonies. We got some Native Americans out here, but we've got militia and we can protect ourselves. What this is really about, you people in London, we know what this is really about. You've got too many people in your army and you don't know what to do with them. So you figure you'll send them over here and give them a cushy job doing nothing over here, and we got to pay for it. That's not fair. That's how the colonists saw it. So the Stamp Act was very unpopular among colonists. A majority considered it a violation of their rights as Englishmen to be taxed without their consent. They still thought of themselves as Englishmen. They do not think of themselves as Americans yet. And as an Englishman, you have the legislators could only tax you if you had consent. Consent that only the colonial legislators could grant. They are voting for people in the colonial legislatures, therefore they can tax us. They weren't voting for people in Parliament, the British legislature. Therefore, why should they be allowed to tax them? Their slogan became, "No taxation without representation." The colonists, who had convened the Stamp Act Congress in October of 1765 to vocalize their opposition to the impending enactment of the Stamp Act, greeted the arrival of the stamps with outrage and violence. Most Americans called for a boycott of British goods, and some organized attacks on the custom houses and homes of tax collectors. Custom houses would be where the tax collectors worked, especially on stuff coming in from another country. After months of protests and an appeal by Benjamin Franklin before the British House of Commons, he actually went to London and tried to plead the case of the American colonists. Parliament voted to repeal the Stamp Act in March of 1766. So we threw such a big hissy fit, and Benjamin Franklin spoke so well, they got rid of it. However, on the same day that they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Acts. And the Declaratory Acts asserted, they said, strongly that the British government had free and total legislative power over the colonies. In other words, we'll get rid of the Stamp Act, but in the future, every law we pass will be upheld, and we're not going to cave till you throw in a hissy fit again.